makes a witch?
What makes a witch? I think being a witch is in your heart and your soul. I don't think there's any one thing that makes a witch. I think it depends on the witch. But I think having an affinity for magic, a desire to go beyond, whatever beyond may be for you, is a huge part of being a witch. But I think witches are unique, so I don't think I can answer that for everybody. I'd say for me, being a witch is about opening to the gateway of magic and seeking to understand interconnectivity and to serve in some way, whether it be the spirits, the earth, the community, or some combination of those. I'm a big believer in the cunning man and cunning woman image of the witch, so I think there's always some type of service, there's some type of interconnection, but it's also the paradox of having to be on the periphery of the community. So even when you're integrated in the community, like we can be in a magical order like the Temple of Witchcraft, we're still on the periphery of society and trying to figure out what our interface point is, because we're not going to be the central pillar to a community, particularly in a modern secular community, but I think we do have a viewpoint that serves. So how do we interface with each other, and how do we interface with the greater whole? But I think the main mechanism of that is magic.
And do you think there's a difference between a witch and a neo-pagan? Is it a very nebulous definition, or is it something very specific? And if so, what does differentiate a witch from a pagan?
I'm a big believer that people should self-identify. So it depends on how people identify as pagan or neo-pagan. When I started out in this, pagan was the larger denomination, kind of like Christian would be a larger denomination, and witchcraft was something specific in that. But there's a lot of witches today now who actually don't even identify as pagan, which I find kind of interesting. And there's a lot of pagans that are really focusing on the religious aspect of things and Reconstructionism. And much like some ancient cultures, despite what we want to believe, don't really embrace witchcraft as well and saw witchcraft as the outside of it. So they're not really looking. We're having interesting conversations about pagan religions that want to demystify and take out the magic and really focus on the religion. I'm obviously not in favor of that for myself, but whatever you want to do is okay, But I think I identify as pagan, I identify as a witch, and both of those terms I've really embraced. I think you use them depending on where you're at. When I began, if people asked what you were into, and it was way before the popular media idea of what a witch was, and it was just few and far between people that were very public, you'd say I'm into earth religions. And then if they were okay with that, then you might use pagan, and at that time most people didn't know what pagan meant, so you could be the people of the land, and people were like, oh, that's cool. And then if they were okay with that, you might use the word Wicca, and really from a more solitary and eclectic base. And then if they were okay with that, you'd say, hey, I'm a witch. But now I run the Temple of Witchcraft, so I start out with I'm a witch, and if they can't handle that, then they're probably not going to last long.
What tarot card are you?
What tarot card? Well, by sun sign, I'm the Hierophant. And so that makes a certain amount of sense for me. By some numerology, I'm the Chariot. And I identify with both of those cards pretty strongly. Yeah.
Are there any outside of those that you of your own accord that you've come across that you really, maybe or even lately, that you strongly identify with?
That's a really great question. I always aspire to the Ten of Cups and that sense of happiness. I don't know if that embodies me, but that's something I always look at as a focus, because I think sometimes we're so much into the mystical struggle, we forget happiness, and we forget fulfillment and satisfaction. And as a good-natured Taurus, I like to be happy and satisfied. So
cool.
I like to move towards that, and particularly on the emotional level. I think I do identify with the Chariot, and Cancer is my rising sign, and the idea of home and family and all of that is really a huge part for me.
A little bit of a curveball.
All right, I can handle it.
Yeah. So I know we spoke last night, and you were sharing that core shamanism is a part of the Temple of Witchcraft. And legality issues aside, and just what are your thoughts or feelings on psychedelic shamanism and its place in magic?
I'm actually a huge proponent of safe and sane uses of entheogens. I'm not a huge proponent of not knowing what you're doing and taking mad amounts of things you don't understand and then thinking you're now a wonderful spiritual practitioner, a master or healer. But I do believe entheogens play a role for those who desire them. I don't think they should be required to move through a magical process. But at the same time, I think they're a part of nature, and I think they trigger some amazing things. I've had some students that have come to me because they've had profound psychedelic experiences and they didn't know what they were doing, and they sought out a teacher to figure it out, and they've progressed amazingly well. I've had some people come to me who've had profound psychedelic experiences, and that becomes the benchmark for everything, and nothing with training or discipline really works for them, because I think they just wired themselves in a way that wasn't super helpful for the long term. So it's the wheel of fate turning from there. I'm a big believer in, and it's a controversial thing amongst some, but the Entheogens of the witchcraft tradition. So we actually work at the very least with the spirits and sometimes the chemicals of the nightshade family and flying ointments and things like that. And we use them in safe and moderated ways, but we also use them because they're part of our spiritual heritage, and they can open a lot of amazing things. If you need flying ointment every day to meditate, then you've probably got a problem. If once a year you punctuate a Sabbath with something that's intense, then I'm okay with that, but we only give that to people who've had a lot of training and a lot of discipline beforehand.
Yeah. Is there any advice you would give to someone going into the psychedelic experience for the first time, particularly in a magical context? Because there are people who've used it recreationally and then they find their path and start to at some point combine the two.
Yeah, I would say, particularly for our path of what we teach here, don't poison yourself is first and foremost. You know, a lot of people think that, you know, it's easy and it's nature and it's safe, and I mean, these are all deadly poisons, and research the ways they're taking it and work with somebody who, I guess the advice for all of it is work with somebody who's taken it, who knows the science and also knows the magic of it. I think it's huge to always have someone watching you when you're using these. Don't do these rituals solitary, and that way if something should go wrong, you get somebody who knows what to do and won't panic and will be able to kind of work with you in that way. And I think in the framework of the spirituality, build a spiritual relationship with the plant substance itself. So start, you know, trying to meditate on the plant spirit before you take it, or if it has a cultural context, a deity or something like that, make offerings to that deity and ask for that deity's guidance. Like for us, a lot of Hecate work is with the nightshade family, so communing with our view of Hecate as the soul of the world. So if you start communing with her in that aspect, that's saying, I want your guidance in this nightshade, baneful, flying ointment work, you know, to attract the right people, the right circumstances, to have the intuition of the right time and place. You know, the whole classic set and setting, make sure you know you do it in the right place and ritual, be protected ritually, but also be safe and sane practically.
And how do you think psychedelics actually relates magically? Like, what is its connection, or what's actually happening on a magical level when you take an entheogen?
I think it depends on the plant spirit. I think each one has a different take on it. The loose way I'd look at it is it opens one of the gates, you know, but different things open the gates differently, and I think part of that's the physical and science of what's the chemical receptors that are going on, what's the biological process, what is that triggering in your magical bodies. Like a lot of the nightshades kind of make your body think it's dying. So a lot of the flying ointment stuff is death and resurrection, going to the Sabbath, meeting the ancestors, meeting the goddesses and gods of death, because your body feels like it's dying. So I think that's what's going on there, you know, but I think I'm not as familiar with, let's say, ayahuasca. I have great interest in it, but that's not my area of expertise or, you know, my cultural context. But I think that's, from my understanding of people who've taken it, students who've taken it, it's the healer of the soul, and it unkinks the knots within your soul framework, and I think that's doing something different in terms of perception and how you relate to the world. And I'm sure I've done things with psilocybin mushrooms, and for me they're very much pulling back the tapestry and pulling back the veil of how things really work. We have a ritual in our tradition that we affectionately call the Green Devil, and it's about the dark side of the green man, and the idea, we often think of the green man as very fecund, and the green leaves and the acorns and the green field, and the green devil is the rot and the mushrooms and the decaying branch and the insects. And he came to me very clearly and said, to unlock my mysteries, you need to take mushrooms, and this is what you want you to do. And the whole ritual that we teach now, which works with the baneful herbs, the platform for it was psilocybin. So to kind of open that up, but that's not something I regularly use. It's something that I just experience in that way.
Awesome, thank you. It seems to tie into a sort of primal aspect of magic, almost shamanic in its own way, like a return of that to, and some of the things that I've seen and felt in rituals here is that element of the primal. At what point, yeah, and
appreciate that.
Really enjoyable. Yeah. At what point did that really enter into your magic, and you know, how and why is it rooted in Temple of Witchcraft?
That's a really great question. How did it enter into my magic? Well, I think a lot of the foundational teachings was really, I'd like to say I had a grand vision of this is what the temple was going to be 20 years ago, and I was not that smart. It was basically just what I was taught by my teachers, and then what I built upon it, and I found myself surrounded by a group of people, because my teachers weren't teaching publicly anymore, saying, hey, show us the stuff. And then when we got as far as I felt comfortable with what I was shared with and what I was taught, they're like, well, what are you doing on your own? And so I kind of had two divergent paths. Kind of doing the basic witchcraft and spellcasting and psychic stuff. I kind of diverted. On one side was very much the shamanic, the healing, the nature-based, which also sort of led me into theosophy and New Age traditions. And then on the other side was the very regimented ceremonial and Kabbalistic and alchemical and the old occult traditions. And I kind of wove back and forth between those two. But I found immense healing going back to the primal. I think we kind of layer ourselves in our society with so many expectations and kind of psychic armor. I think sometimes it gets back to what Austin Spare, I think, was the first one I read it about, talking about the atavistic, kind of going back to that primal. And I think you need to do that bodily. And it was a real keen understanding that body and spirit, although are different things, are not separate. And it's the interplay between them. So the dancing, the drumming, plant substances, the idea of the ordeal, sitting outside alone for a specific period of time, or being in the dark for a specific period of time, it triggers primal things. And I found for myself I was able to shed unhelpful things that no longer served, or I was able to conjure things that I think we forget in our society. And so when people started asking me to share more, I started like, oh, let's try this. So this is what worked for me. And eventually that kind of got, I wouldn't say codified, but systemized into something that was a logical progression. And that's what I started sharing with larger groups.
Awesome. What is the strangest or weirdest sort of ritual happening or synchronicity that you've encountered that you're willing to share?
The weirdest, strangest synchronicity. Well, I would say the most mind-blowing beyond my initial training. I was working with somebody who was basically on their deathbed in the hospital. And the couple that called me, the wife called me and her husband was on his deathbed. And they had come to a class of mine on crystal healing. And I knew that, but I always assumed that people that know what I do, and I talk about it pretty freely, that I'm a witch and I happen to be in a lot of different disciplines. So they were calling me as a crystal healer to cure him, like some miracle at the last minute. But the way it was framed and the level of seriousness, I thought they were naturally calling me for last rites. So I went in under one mindset and realized, oh, they're in a very different mindset, and I was correct in ultimately where things were going. But it was the process of ministering and having to prep them for, this is the reality of your situation, yet what can we do to alleviate pain, what can we do to alleviate fear. So I actually spent a good 10 days in the hospital just talking and visiting as I could and everything. It was actually right around September 11th, and it was a heightened time of fear and emotion and everything. And we were doing one healing ceremony, and the doctors were so lovely about just giving us space to do whatever was going to bring him comfort. And on top of everything that was going on, there was a bowel obstruction, and they were talking actually just to alleviate pain, to do a surgery to remove the bowel obstruction. And so I very clearly remember doing a healing in a much more shamanic context, and I think it was one of the few non-coven situations where I was ritually overshadowed. I would hesitate to say fully possessed, but I was not in the driver's seat, I guess I will say. And the oddness of conducting that without your usual accoutrements of candles and incense and coven and all that in a hospital room. And going through this kind of healing, and really for me it was just about alleviating pain. And then and I remember clearly too, because they were doing it was a Catholic hospital, which ironically that all this was going on, and they were doing Psalm 23 over the loudspeaker after I started, and the family was in the room and everyone was praying in their own way, which I encouraged them to do, and I just wanted to alleviate suffering however that would be. And nice ritually, felt good about it, but he was still kind of a skeptic, so he was like, okay, well, it was a nice little ritual. And then went to do the final scan before the surgery, and the obstruction was completely gone. To the point where then the doctor started consulting with me about the course of practice, and I had to say, nope, you're the medical person, I'll be here for the spiritual person, like, you tell us what's going on and I'll see what he wants to do. And ultimately still he progressed towards transitioning and crossing over, but it was a very physical, mind-blowing experience that interfaced with possessory work, with shamanic healing, and realizing that it doesn't always have to be in a temple or in a field. It can be wherever you are, including a hospital room filled with a bunch of Catholics who are praying for you.
Yeah. And also for the Discordians out there, the 23 reference.
Yeah.
The 23 synchronicity.
Yeah, exactly.
All their bells are going off.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was intense, and it's a profound memory for me.
Wonderful, thank you. There's sort of a meme going around of, this is my power animal, this is my spirit animal, in the context of something usually very silly. Somebody will see, and they'll say, Pink Panther is my spirit animal or something. So in the cartoon world, what is your spirit animal?
In the cartoon world?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I don't know what my cartoon spirit animal would be. I don't know if I need to make two. I think right now it would be probably a lion of Voltron. I'm very obsessed with Voltron.
Yeah.
So it's
one of the lions?
and out of all the lions, probably the black lion.
Black line.
Black line, yeah.
The center, right?
The center, the heart, the head.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
If you could build a ritual dream team of anyone living or among the mighty dead, the ancestors,
Wow.
who would be on your ritual dream team?
Wow. That's a great question. I think we'd all be so fractious. I don't know if my dream team would actually do well. I think Austin Spare would be kind of interesting, although I don't know how well he would be in group ritual context, but just to like have the ritual team conveying and chatting about stuff, I think that would be pretty amazing. Actually, I've always had a great love in my heart for Alexander's, and I would love to have been in a room and chat with him and to see what that's like. And I have a lot of beloved Alexandrian friends that knew him and know Maxine pretty well, so that I think would be interesting just from that and to be in ritual with him. I'm totally spacing on her name right now. British occultist, did the angel correspondence course.
Doreen Virtue?
No, not Doreen Virtue.
Valiente?
Not Doreen, although
There's a big difference.
I love Doreen Valiente, but there's a very big difference between the Doreens. Doreen Valiente was definitely on the dream team. There was another one whose name is escaping me because it's 4th day of TempleFest and I'm tired.
Sure.
But she did an angelic, she was a contemporary of Aleister Crowley's. She did a totally separate angelic correspondence course, and she'd reveal in the middle of it that was all about Lucifer. And that was like your test to go in or go out. But her name is escaping right now, but she'd be very fascinating for that. And I'd say of living folks too, I actually love doing ritual with Oberon Zell. I've been very honored to actually be in ritual with Oberon Zell, both with him leading it and times with me leading it. And he's just so fun and so interesting. I'd like to throw him in the mix and see what happens.
If you could ask any of those people one question, who would it be and what would the question be?
Ooh. Madeline Montalban was the person I couldn't remember.
Very good.
I would ask her where'd she get her Lucifer stuff. Yeah,
Interesting.
just because it's curious.
Yeah.
That's kind of the question in the end for me. I'm very about Venusian, Aphrodite, Morning Star kind of mythologies, Promethean, light bearer mythology. So when people have a take that is a little outside of the mainstream academic history, I'm always like, where'd you get that? Was that personal gnosis? Was that something transmitted? Was that something given to you by a teacher? But there's one Pantheacon many years ago where it felt like the underlying theme of everything was some type of light bearer or Lucifer figure, and I felt like every class I was in, I'd be raising my hand going, but what about Lucifer? And I don't identify as a Luciferian, but I do identify with the light bearer aspects of it.
I noticed that there is a difference between our everyday persona and mask and our ritual selves.
Absolutely.
And some people have a difficult time finding their ritual self. There is an aspect of performance and finding that balance between authenticity and theatrical.
Right.
And could you speak to that and maybe offer some advice to folks who are having some difficulty finding their ritual self and expressing themselves in that way?
Well, it's interesting you should say that because I feel like I do struggle with that myself. I think also because of public teaching, which is a sort of ritual as well. It's different public teaching when you've got 3 or 4 people in a circle as opposed to when you're speaking in a large group of people or you're at a festival or symposium. And that idea that you have to be on. And to me, that's the same skill set that I use in ritual because there's a certain level of having to have that current on and flowing through you. And I struggle with that whole authenticity because I'm an introvert. So I can be extroverted in actions and I can be functional and I can do all that work, but that's not the way the current is on for me. The current is on for me when I'm behind the computer writing something, or when I'm in a solitary ritual, or when I'm just in a very close group of friends. And so having to find where that switch is and know when to turn it on, and almost like a volume knob. So for me, the magical personality and the speaker personality is very similar in the sense that it's your core self of who you are in this world, or your middle self is what we call it, the namer of the 3 soul theory. But the idea that the volume can go up and on. And so my comfort level is probably around a 2 or 3 in my everyday life, but just taking those natural tendencies and personality flares and ritual drama to it, and not constructing something totally different, but just turning up the volume to it. I think some rituals, though, in terms of ritual work, you're assuming a different aspect. Like we've talked a lot this weekend at TempleFest about the seer and the sorcerer and the sovereign. So those are 3 kind of ritual mantles, is the way I would look at it. And in some rituals, when I'm playing one of those roles, or if you're the priest invoking a horned god, or if you're a priestess invoking some aspect of the lady, you're going to assume that mantle, and it's almost like a filter that goes over you, like a colored gel over a light in theater. So it's your essential light being shined through this image to kind of embody that. And then if you get into invocatory work, it's about how much of that is you and how much of that is that other light. But I think for the most part, for me, I think of it as a form of musician about volume. It's about turning things up or turning things down, and but taking that essential self to be authentic. So, when you see me talking in front of a large group of people, the goofiness is still me, and the drama is still me, and that's how I may act, but it's just turned up compared to how I would be if I was in my living room.
That's a great analogy. And advice for people who are either entering shadow work for the first time consciously, or people who are struggling with shadow work.
Get a therapist.
Yeah.
And it sounds kind of funny, but it's the idea that I think you need somebody outside of your coven, school, teacher to process and bounce ideas off of and have dialogue with that can give you an honest answer, who's invested in giving you an honest answer, not what you want to hear. I think it's tough with friends and spouses, although they can be great support too. If not a therapist, some type of healer who has pastoral care or counseling skills who can speak in that way, but having someone outside of the direct teacher-student relationship, particularly if you have a background of trauma or difficulty, or we may all have a background of trauma and difficulty and just not know, but if you feel like that's lurking or it's rumbling or you're having difficulties, getting that outside support. I'm also a huge believer in the energetic maintenance of outside support. So when I started into shadow work, I was working with a flower essence consultant. So it was almost like an hour of talk therapy of like, what's your issues? And they'd give ideas about strategies of how to handle those issues, and would choose flower essences, which are vibrational remedies to help heal people on a mental, emotional, spiritual level, and then working through those issues through a month, and also being accountable to somebody other than my teacher to go back in another month and say, hey, this is what I did, this is what I didn't do, this is what I'm struggling with, and having that outside view, because we often project as both a student and as a teacher, we often project stuff onto our teachers, onto our coven mates, that may be in reality, that may not be in reality. So sometimes you need someone to give you a check and say, hey, this might be your stuff, this might not have anything to do with what they're actually doing. And it's nice to have that outside support.
And you think some of it would have to do with context of having to articulate some of these things in non-magical terms, say with a psychotherapist, and really a grounding effect of that?
I think that's very grounding, because I think it's very easy to get into mystical delusion, in the sense of everything is the sacred drama. I'd heard very early on from a teacher in the beginning of my training that those who do not embody sacred drama and ritual will be forced to experience drama in daily life. And I think that's very huge. So I think understanding the context of the ritual barrier and boundary and daily life, I think grounds. So save all that drama for that ritual experience, process it in that way, but then ground it into your ordinary feelings and relationships, and having to talk to somebody who hopefully is open. Always get a therapist or a healer that's open to these magical processes, and there's a lot more out there than you think. But at the same time, don't necessarily assume they're going to know, I crossed the abyss, and they're going to know what that means, because you probably didn't. But if they think that that's what it is, what does that mean to you? What does abyss mean to you? What does crossing mean to you? When you say, I've conjured my shadow, there's the Jungian idea of the shadow, but say to the therapist, what does this mean to me? How did it manifest? How are you feeling about it? What's going on in your body? Those are all very grounding things, and a good therapist is going to ask you those questions or lead you to those questions.
Right. Speaking of ritual drama, the role of initiation.
Yes.
And how you feel it plays out in and outside of a temple space.
I'm so glad you asked the question the way you did, because it gives me an opening of how I really feel about it. I think there's that, going back to Dion Fortune, there's that one true initiator. I think it's a force, however you're going to describe it. I think you have to be properly prepared for initiation, but I think that doesn't always mean what often ritualists think it means. I think sometimes life prepares you, and by preparing you, often puts you in circumstances where you feel completely unprepared. I think life is the great initiator on one level. I think magic is a great trigger or catalyst for those initiations. I've known many people who have experienced profound initiation in a ritual setting, but it's usually triggered or catalyzed stuff in their personal life. And when I observe an initiation ritual or hear about an initiation ritual and nothing has been triggered in any other level, I wonder what went on there. And some initiation rituals just connect you to an egregore, and that's still beautiful. But I think if it's truly an expansion of consciousness, things have to shift on some level. And I know some amazing people who have never undergone a formal initiation ritual, who are initiates of the grand cosmic sisterhood, brotherhood, otherhood of order, and they've never stepped into a circle or they've never stepped into a lodge, but they have expanded consciousness and they've aligned their souls, and from my perspective, whatever their perspective may be. And I know people who've gone through high levels of initiation in various magical orders, and I don't feel a lot. And that might be me. That might be a flaw of my own perception, and I'm not where they're at to be able to see it. So who am I to judge? But it's interesting to watch the catalyst process. I'm always about triggers and catalyst and how consciousness shifts and expands and aligns. And I think that happens under a lot of different circumstances. And sometimes initiations really are seeds planted, and you might not see the effect. So even if you don't feel something, it might unfold years later. And sometimes initiations actually trigger you to leave the tradition and go find what really was at your heart because your consciousness rejected that on some level. And I think that's good too. You know, people need to be where they need to be, and we shouldn't have judgment about that.
You travel quite a lot to festivals.
I do. A little less lately, but yeah, I do.
You know, of course, without naming names or any very specifics, but overall, what do you really feel that festivals can do better?
Ooh, festivals can do better. I actually, at the point now, I don't go to festivals that I don't think are well run. You know, so I like them. I think a lot of it's logistics. And now that I'm on the other side of it, running a festival or helping to run a festival, because I don't really run TempleFest, we have an amazing staff, Team TempleFest, that does it. But I think the logistics of it are really key. I think sometimes pagans, magicians, magical people, witches feel this, like, if I build it, they will come. And having a business background, that's just not true. Like, you need to have a plan, you need to have a business model, you need to have a production schedule, you need to hold people accountable. And it's a whole business process on top of running a coven, on top of running a lodge, on top of running a community in other ways, and having clearly defined, as Courtney Weber said in our keynote, you know, this weekend, having clearly defined job descriptions and knowing who's responsible for what and what's the process of getting things. Because I find that when events have gone more difficultly, it's because the logistics have failed. Often the magic is really great. The people are almost always wonderful. It's very rare that you go to a festival that you're like, oh, everybody here was awful. You know, the people are really wonderful. But if you didn't have a good time, it's usually because something didn't go well. But part of it's also planning. We've had festivals that have not gone super well, and we, you know, do a check-in at the end of it, you know, or check in the next week and say what worked well, what didn't work well, how can we fix the things that didn't work well, and then actually following up with that. Because I've been to some festivals that haven't worked super well, and you go back the next time, and the things that didn't work well still are not working well. So there's got to be some type of change and growth. But as leadership changes, everybody's got to make their own mistakes too, and you've got to allow for people to fail, and you've got to allow for things to not go well and see what that looks like, because that's a part of community too. It's not always going to be perfect.
Yeah. What do you think festival goers can do better?
Participate. I think, and it's hard. As I said, I'm an introvert, so I think a lot of people want to just kind of show up and observe, or they don't want to fully commit. But I know for the festivals I've both been speaking at and have gone and just to attend, or even worked on or outside of the temple, it's fully participating, fully committing to it has been the huge part of it. And just if you want to have a deep experience, you have to immerse yourself deeply. And I know that can be hard the first time, but once you've got a little bit of the swing of it, just pitch in both on the community side of what can I do to help out, and they often have volunteer programs, but also immerse yourself in the rituals, immerse yourself in the experience, allow yourself to the level of which you feel safe to go deeper and just let the magic work.